On the outskirts of the city of Elgin, with all its hustle, bustle, and stress, lies another city, a silent city. It is laid out like a city, with streets, avenues, and even an alley. Here, all is calm and far from the stressful life of the city. It is a silent city, made up of the former residents who have gone on to their reward. Like all cemeteries, Bluff City Cemetery serves two equally important functions. It offers a place of final rest for our deceased families, neighbors, and friends. Just as importantly, it offers a place for the living to gather, to remember, and to celebrate life. On each grave, you are sure to find the bare facts: the name of the deceased, their date of birth, and their date of death. Yet some gravestones want to tell us more, if we are listening. A walk among the gravestones at Bluff City Cemetery gives many examples of the symbolism and imagery found on grave markers. Let's walk among Elgin's past residents and learn about this symbolism. While the oldest grave markers were simple, showing only the name and date information for the deceased, beginning in the early 1800s, grave markers began to include hopeful imagery of the afterlife. Gravestones began to send a message to the living rather than just record the facts of the dead. Angels and hands reaching down from heaven were used to show the ascension of one's spirit after death. Clasped hands were symbolic of a final goodbye, or a spouse who had died earlier guiding the deceased to the afterlife. A broken chain showed a life ended too soon. During the Victorian period, images of nature became common. These images were meant to send a message about the deceased, but also offer comfort to the living. A tree with a broken limb symbolized death, a cutting off of life. Curling or missing bark symbolized the same. Ivy symbolized friendship, immortality, and memory. Notice how it trails up the grave marker in an eternal embrace. The Victorians spoke in the language of flowers, and each had a meaning. Roses for love, oak leaves for strength, honor, and hospitality, lily of the valley for purity and humility, palms for victory over death. Acanthus leaves came to symbolize heavenly gardens because the tree commonly grew in rocky soil too rocky for farming, land that towns often found useful for cemeteries. A bundle of wheat symbolized a long life, one that was harvested by the grim reaper at the end. A cornucopia overflowing with fruit indicated much the same, a fruitful life at the end of its natural cycle. Animal imagery was common on the gravestones of children. Lambs and birds are often found on the markers of the young. Birds in flight symbolize a winged soul, a life cut short. A lamb is common in Christian imagery and depicts the purity and innocence of children. The reference to living items, trees, flowers, and animals was meant to turn the focus from the sorrow of death back to the joy of living. Many of the other common images associated with somber grave markers originate from the Victorian era. Urns came to symbolize death and the return of the earthly body to dust. Urns are often placed on a pedestal to venerate or honor the deceased. The higher the pedestal, the closer to heaven, and the more honorable the person. Perhaps the origin of the phrase, putting someone on a pedestal. Draped fabric, artistically created out of solid stone, symbolized the veil between life and death. The draping was also a representation of the funeral and mourning itself, remembering a time when funerals were held in the home. Mirrors, stair railings, and artwork were draped in black crepe fabric to prepare the home for loved ones visiting to pay their respects to the deceased and to indicate the home was in mourning. Represented in one's gravestone, this draping is a lasting symbol of that mourning. The enthusiasm for archaeological exploration in the Victorian era led to a new influence of classical Greek, Roman, and ancient Egyptian motifs. The use of classically inspired sarcophagi, or exposed burial vaults above ground, indicate this influence and offer a greater canvas for other imagery, such as Greek and Roman-inspired columns, urns, and other symbols. Geometric shapes, such as orbs and pyramids, also became common. The most common geometric shape was the obelisk. The Egyptian god of the sun, Ra, was said to have lived within an obelisk. An obelisk grave marker represents great social status, the eternal rays of sunshine beaming down on the deceased, or a spiritual connection between heaven and earth. Some imagery found on grave markers is very personal, telling an important fact about the deceased. a hobby they enjoyed, their profession, or their club affiliation. Military service may also be represented in the gravestone artwork. An anchor and rope, or an emblem may show military service. Just as each life is different, so is how we choose to remember and celebrate it. The emotions surrounding death are made permanent by the imagery and symbols used on grave markers.